that house on the right's providing a lot more wildlife habitat and also probably doing a lot better for water quality and other things. So just a side-by-side comparison. Here's another side-by-side comparison. Again, I'm definitely not a landscape architect and the person designing these things, but thinking creatively about how we can use the spaces that we have and working towards using natural processes, natural features in our landscape to try to reduce the amount of turf grass in our yard and also maybe improve some aesthetics. And we'll actually come back to this graphic on the right throughout the talk to try to talk about how it is that we can also mow less often, and make good wildlife habitat while we're doing it. So if nothing else, if you don't remember anything else from this talk today, it's park the mower for a little more if you can. So that's the rule number one. The next rule is one we'll spend a little more time on, and that is mimic natural places. And this is what I mean when I say that I kind of bring my perspectives from working on wildlife in natural areas and on farms to the cities. And that is essentially wildlife respond mostly to vegetation characteristics and to vegetation structure and arrangement. And what we call appropriate vegetation characteristics and structure is wildlife habitat. Now, this is a word, of course, that we hear thrown around all the time. People that are go through training in wildlife conservation like I do get bludgeoned over the head with textbooks defining what habitat really is. And we're reminded that to say habitat is almost meaningless because, for example, I see this time of year particularly European starlings quickly going in and out of the poles that traffic signals are hung on at intersections. If you watch closely, you'll see European starlings going in and out of any holes. That's because they're cavity nesting birds, and they find holes in those pipes and think they make pretty good nesting habitat for European starling to raise young. So when I say habitat, I bet you're not picturing a light post, but to a European starling, that's habitat. So we have to remember that habitat, the word alone, is meaningless. We have to remember the constituent parts that make up habitat and then the species for which we're managing our environment that we choose to manage for. So those constituent parts are the three things we all need to survive, and then their arrangement or configuration on the landscape. And so the three things that we all need to survive are food, water, and shelter. And then the considerations for space acknowledges things like we can't have all the food in Washington County, all the water in Johnson County, and all the shelter in Lynn County. No wildlife are going to do well in that environment. So their specific arrangement. And so I'm going to talk about each one of these elements, and I'm going to use this nice yard or this nice design to help us think about where it is in our own environments we may be able to create food, water, shelter, and in the appropriate spatial arrangement to make the most for wildlife in our backyards. So the first thing is food. Where do we find food? We find food all over in natural areas, of course, and we can think of lots of ways to grow food for wildlife in our own backyards. One common food source is what we call mast, which is just a technical term for fruits. In this case, I have a picture of dogwood fruits that are just starting to ripen. I don't have very many pictures of dogwood fruits that are ripe because the birds, almost without exception, beat me to them. And so I have to use this green picture to make that point, that dogwoods and other native shrubs produce really good fruit sources that are really important, particularly for migrating birds in the fall. And so we can find lots of food, we can plant lots of plants that produce fruits, also including hard mass like acorns and hickory nuts, to provide wildlife habitat in our backyard, or this element of wildlife habitat. Another really important type of food source that we can provide in our backyards is nectar. And this, of course, is primarily for insects, but we have a few bird species that also like to use nectar. And nectar, of course, comes from any flowering plants that bloom. And we want to think about providing nectar resources for insects throughout the entire growing season. And so what I always say for this one is that you should, in your yard or in land that you have influence over, you should be able to make a bouquet a day from, I got to think of the date, well, from about May 1st, May 15th until late September. You want to be able to make a bouquet a day. Now, probably don't do it unless you have a big yard, and then beautify your home and leave some for the insects. But if you can make a bouquet a day, then you know that you can provide habitat. For example, in a few weeks, all the queen bees of our native bees are going to emerge, and they need to feed right away because they've had a long winter in a dead log or underneath the ground, and they need to find food and start their life cycle early on. So they're going to go right into the forest where we find a bunch of blooming spring ephemeral wildflowers that are in a hurry to beat the leaves blooming. So we got to provide nectar resources for them. And then as you move throughout the year, of course, we find other insects that come on and start to look for nectar resources throughout the year. The monarch butterfly will be back from Mexico and a few generations removed in a few weeks. And of course, those adults need a lot of milkweed, like we're going to talk, to raise their young, but they also need nectar resources to be able to fuel their own migrations, either continuing on to Minnesota and to the north or staying right here to raise their young. So we need lots of nectar resources, and we need it throughout the entire growing season in our backyard. And then the last thing is animals like to eat animals. And so, and that's completely fine. And so the easiest one for us to all imagine is animals eating other insects. We could also imagine, of course, animals eating vertebrates, and that's fine too, and kind of fun to watch play out. But insects are really important in structuring the wildlife. The terrestrial insects, of course, are wildlife, but in structuring the terrestrial vertebrate communities like birds and mammals in our backyards. So this picture here is the caterpillar of a viceroy, which is a relatively common Iowa butterfly. It looks literally just like a monarch. The viceroy is a relatively common caterpillar, and we know that caterpillars are essentially the fuel that feeds growing birds. And so any growing birds that we have nesting in our backyards or nearby have to be able to find these energy-rich animal protein sources, like caterpillars, on plants in our backyards to attract, to feed their young so that they can grow and start to fly. So caterpillars, of course, we know from the example of the monarch, many organisms, many species that make caterpillars as part of their life cycle have really specialized adaptations. So in the case of the monarch, monarchs absolutely have to have milkweed to raise their caterpillars before they turn into adult caterpillars and feed on nectar resources, or excuse me, adult monarchs and feed on nectar resources. We know that from a bunch of research that caterpillars are much more abundant on native plants in Iowa and other Midwestern ecosystems than they are on exotic plants. That's because those caterpillars have traditionally evolved to have specialized adaptations to be able to eat the native plants that they were accustomed to finding. And so some really neat research out of Delaware found that as the percentage of non-native plants in a backyard increased, the probability of a Carolina chickadee fledging young decreased linearly. So to the point where at almost 100% non-native plants in the backyard, almost no Carolina chickadee young were fledged. And that's because those non-native plants just aren't hosting the diversity of insects that the Carolina chickadee needs to find to take back to their nest and feed to their young. And so it's not a direct connection. It's not necessarily that the non-native plants are not, it's not necessarily that the non-native plants are causing harm directly to the chickadee, but rather because the non-native plants don't appeal to the insects and the insects aren't there for the chickadees, the chickadee populations decline. It demonstrates the complexity of these systems and also the importance of thinking about how it is that we can have insect habitat in our backyard that's good for wildlife as well. Okay, so those are the main food sources when we think of wildlife habitat in the backyard. Next, we want to think about shelter, places for wildlife to live and places for wildlife to hide. And so we may think of a place for an animal to put its nest, like this robin nest. Robins, of course, like putting their nest on platforms or on flat structures where they can find, for example, in branching areas of a shrub or a bush. We also know that shrubs and small trees that have a lot of horizontal, complex branching are more attractive to birds than those that have a bunch of really vertical stems. Other places to put nests are quite variable. We could have dead logs, as we'll talk. We could have ground nesting birds even. And then we can also have animals hiding in important vegetation structure as well. So dead wood is really important habitat element if it's safe. I don't tell people to leave big dead dying trees right next to their house or over the sidewalk. But in many places in our yard, there may be a dead branch on a tree that's completely harmless. And no sense in knocking that down or taking it out if it's going to stay there and not present any threat, because the wildlife will take advantage of it. The life or impact of a tree extends far beyond the period that it was actively growing. And so dead wood can provide really good habitat for wildlife. This includes things, of course, like familiar cavity nesting birds like woodpeckers, but also things like bats, and a huge diversity of insects rely on finding dead wood in their environment. Another place we can find dead wood and think about a place to have more habitat diversity or shelter diversity in our backyards is by providing downwood. So again, if you have a natural area, like for example on our picture on the right, the dense plantings on the south side of this house, you could surely have downwood in those areas as well, and that's going to provide places for reptiles or amphibians to escape the elements, or it might provide a lot of important habitat for a bunch of insects that may feed birds or just be fun to watch on their own. Another type of shelter that we can provide in our backyards, and many people think about this, is constructed things. We can build things for wildlife to provide habitat for them in our own backyard. So here's an example of a bluebird box. It would depend on your own backyard whether or not you could attract bluebirds, but surely you could find something that would want to use a birdhouse in your backyard, be it a wren or a chickadee or a bluebird, or even if you're close to a wetland or a stream, a wood duck. And so there's a lot of things that we could do. And this kind of is a fun winter project. We could think about building shelters that we'll put out this time of year for wildlife to start to take advantage of. And then the last component of shelter that I always like to emphasize is don't forget about the winter time. Of course, many wildlife stick around with us and endure the winter right along with us. Some wildlife even come down from northern environments and think our winters are mild and hang out in our backyards and in our urban spaces. So this is a picture that I took on Iowa State's campus, actually, and you can just barely see there's a cottontail right there. And it's taking advantage, of course, of this, the residue of last year's beautiful flowering asters, I think, in this case. And so I think this is kind of a cool strategy that Iowa State was using, at least in this small part, was to just leave that stuff. There's a bunch of seeds that were produced. So the flowers provided a really good nectar resource, but then they produced seeds, and lots of small mammals and birds will take advantage of those seeds during the wintertime. And then they also provide shelter, so places for animals to hide, maybe adjacent to a food source. That can be the difference between being predated by an owl or a fox or not. And so providing shelter during the wintertime, especially during periods of snowfall, can be really good for wildlife. And we find that by leaving, for example, not cleaning up gardens until early in the spring after winter has broke, or we could find it by planting evergreens or other sorts of shrubs that provide shrubs or trees that provide winter habitat. So the next element of the habitat of wildlife habitat is water, and we can provide water in a bunch of different ways. One really cool way, if it works in your backyard, is to think about a way to build a natural water feature. So this is a natural water feature in the backyard of a colleague of mine, and he put this water feature in, and he also planted a bunch of native wetland plants all around the outside of it. And that water feature attracts a bunch of different wildlife that otherwise wouldn't be attracted to his yard, because in his neighborhood it's hard to find clean surface water. And so you can have amphibians in your backyard, or you can attract different types of birds that otherwise wouldn't visit if you had space and had an interest in providing a water resource. And then, of course, you can also provide water resources in sort of an artificial way through providing bird baths or other things, as long as you keep them clean and don't let them get too stagnant for or mosquito habitat. Okay, so the last consideration, we just went over the 3 elements of wildlife habitat, the 3 elements that we all also need to survive, food, water, and shelter, and now we can explore space. One is just imagine the spatial arrangement of this landscape over here. They used wildlife habitat also to address issues with like prevailing winds coming out of the south. They also provided some structure. So something that's kind of cool that landscape design folks will talk about is layering your landscaping in your backyard. So you have maybe tall features in the back, and then intermediate size, and then small like a pollinator garden in the front. So you could imagine a layering approach that provides both an appealing aesthetic and also the right spatial configuration for wildlife to find food, water, and shelter all right in your own backyard. The other really important thing that I want to hit on with space is that you may have the best wildlife habitat in the world. If you're alone in a desert of mowed monoculture yards or parking lots, you're probably not going to have very much wildlife diversity. So do what you're doing, but then talk to the neighbors and convince them to come along with it. Some of this stuff, there's some interesting scholarship out of Michigan that found that as neighborhoods had more and more natural landscaping in their backyards, mowing less, providing more diverse native plants in their backyards, as more neighbors did that, it was more likely that others would come along with it. There's like a social contagion in this sort of environmentally friendly, wildlife-friendly landscaping. And so I think that's something that we have a lot of work to do on in Iowa. Some people may look at you funny when you stop mowing a certain portion or plant your front yard to a prairie. But if you tell your story and talk about that and hold strong, hopefully others will come along, and then it'll be accepted as the norm. Okay, so the next point, and I've been alluding to this as I've gone, but I want to spend a little bit of time on this. Choose a diversity of native or benign plants. And I'm going to talk almost exclusively about native. I used to just say choose diverse native plants, but then the horticulturalist said, you know, there's some exotic plants that don't really do much harm, and so you should acknowledge that, and so I'm acknowledging that. But now I'm going to talk about native plants, because native plants excite me, and I think they should excite you. Iowa was once over 80% tallgrass prairie. It's the reason we have the soils, the rich soils that our economy is built on today. And these tallgrass prairie ecosystems had a huge amount of plant and animal diversity in them. And in fact, in the tallgrass prairie in Iowa alone, over 300 species of flowering plant have been documented. This is a picture of a flowering prairie at Neal Smith National Wildlife Refuge that I took sometime in July. And just from my desk, looking at this picture, I can pick out some of these really pretty flowering plants at this one time stamp in this single prairie. Here's Culver's root, white wild indigo, lead plant, rattlesnake master, which is definitely the coolest named native plant in Iowa, I think, hearing no objections. Purple coneflower, gray-headed coneflower, and wild bergamot. Of course, that ignores all the different types of warm season grasses in the picture and even other flowering plants that we can see. And then, of course, lots of stuff that has already bloomed or has yet to bloom. There is a huge amount of diversity that we can choose from our own natural ecosystems, in this case, the tallgrass prairie. We know, of course, that planting milkweeds can be really important for the monarch butterfly and also providing a very aesthetically pleasing flower and an important nectar resource for monarchs and other pollinators. And we have over 15 species of native milkweeds found in Iowa. Here's 3 of the most common ones. Among all of these, common milkweed grows out of cracks in the sidewalk, so I promise you can find places to grow it in your own yard. I literally have a picture that I wish I would have included in the talk of common milkweed growing out of a retaining wall in Ames. So it's not that hard. If we spare it the mower and spare it the herbicide, common milkweed can do well in almost anywhere in Iowa. And these other ones can do well in many places as well. And like I said, there's over a dozen more options. Here's some up-close pictures of common native flowering plants that you could also include. I imagine many of you are familiar with these, but part of my goal when I talk about native plants is to just help people with the language to start to recognize some of these flowers that we see routinely in landscapes are actually Iowa native plants. They do well in our soils, they do well in our climate, and they also have deep roots, literally and figuratively running back through Iowa's history. Many species of native grasses were also, of course, found in Iowa's prairies, and some of those have been either adapted or just planted in urban spaces and are quite aesthetically pleasing. Prairie dropseed is one I've planted at my house, and it's really pretty native warm season grass, and little bluestem as well. Many of Iowa's native grasses are bunch grasses, so they grow in clumps, which makes them good for landscapes, and it also makes them good for wildlife because they can fit in between the different clumps and be safe. So that was all about the tallgrass prairie. We know, of course, a little over 10% of Iowa's land area at the time of European settlement was also in forested areas. These forested areas were primarily associated with river systems, just like they are today. Places where the fire was not able to get was eventually matured into the forest. And of course, we have a large diversity of native plants found in forests and shady ecosystems. So a few of those native plants include Virginia bluebells, which is a spring ephemeral wildflower that'll be blooming here within a month probably. Shooting star and Dutchman's breeches, all common wildflowers in Iowa woodlands. Other common shade-tolerant native plants that we see in landscapes include maidenhair fir and some other native ferns, and American alum root, which also includes some horticultural varieties. And then my last point is that wet areas. Many times in our landscapes we have wet areas, or we may want to address stormwater or water quality issues in urban spaces and need plants to help us do that, plants with deep roots. Well, the good news is that about 25% of Iowa's land area was wet, had consistently wet soils that created a lot of new niches for plants to occupy. And so we find a large diversity of plants also in our wetland environments, both in shady areas and also out in the prairie or open areas. This picture is a picture from a reconstructed wetland in Boone County that I took, and you can just see all the diversity of different types of wetland plants in that picture. And then here's a few of my favorite aesthetically pleasing wetland plants that we could consider planting in wet areas in our own yard or in community gardens. Blue flag iris is a beautiful native wetland plant. Cardinal flower, I think, is just the prettiest red flower I've ever seen, just a really deep red flower that blooms in late summer. And elderberry, you can make jam or wine or whatever you like out of the fruit, but the flower is beautiful and it's a really nice shrub that grows well in wet areas. So that was sort of a crash course in covering the basics of diverse native plants. And I'm going to show you some resources here when I wrap up about where you can learn more about what plants are native to Iowa and which ones aren't. So the last thing that I want to talk about, or the last rule for making landscapes work for wildlife, is to protect wildlife and also to remember that decisions that we make in our backyards can have impacts on wildlife and wildlife habitat and natural areas far away from our own places when it comes to exotic invasive species. And so that's what I want to talk about now. The first order of business, if I didn't offend anybody with my mowing comment, I may offend somebody with my bird comments, or my cat comments. I've been in this job for 4 years and I'm getting more bold because I think this is important stuff to talk about. Outdoor cats are a problem for wildlife. Simply stated, they're the number one non-natural, which is a little bit subjective, but non-natural or human-caused mortality source for small mammals and birds. We're talking billions of birds and small mammals killed annually. Now, I'm not picking the barn cat fight because those small mammals probably didn't need to be in the barn anyway. And so I recognize that cats may play a role in pest management scenarios and things like that. But cats in cities can safely stay inside. It's good for the cat and it's definitely good for the wildlife. If you want to have a cat that's outside, that's fine too. Of course, I'm not saying you can't do that, but I don't know that I'd encourage you to do what I just told you to do, attract all these wildlife to your yard, and especially birds, and then introduce a real problematic mortality source with a free-ranging cat. So, and then, hey, talk to your neighbors about this one too, maybe. I have a neighbor to talk to. So that's one point to address, and at least acknowledge that this is a real challenge that we face. It's a real challenge in island environments. In Iowa, we don't have any species of birds threatened with extinction because of cats, but it certainly isn't doing any favors. So the next thing is, so that's protect wildlife. Other ways to protect wildlife is you probably shouldn't put a food resource right next to a really busy road, at least for some organisms. Some are fine near roads, but you may think about people and other interactions with your landscape. Just sort of, we have to remember the complex system where we're working. Then the last point on this, point number 4, is to protect natural areas. And so this is to make the point that decisions that we make in urban spaces can have unintended negative consequences in natural areas. And so this picture, I took this picture in Ledges State Park in central Iowa. And this is Japanese barberry. Of course, as the name implies, it's not a native plant. It's, of course, native to Asia. And Japanese barberry, I think they sell this stuff like at grocery stores and gas stations. I mean, this stuff is really easy to grow. And that's one of the challenges that we have, is that generally the plants that are really easy to grow in urban places are easy to grow because they don't have any natural predators, they don't have any natural pests, and wildlife don't want to eat them. And so those same plants are oftentimes the same plants that once they get introduced into a wildlife area, nothing wants to eat them, but they find that the soils and climate are just like the place in Asia where they came from, and they take off in those areas and become really problematic, exotic, invasive species. And so this is a challenge that we have with some species like Japanese barberry, bush honeysuckle, Chinese silvergrass, which is growing here in this road ditch, Oriental bittersweet, the exotic species of burning bush, which is Euonymus altus. We have a native species, and Siberian elm, and a bunch of others. And these plants, again, this was not done with bad intentions. Nobody has a burning bush or a exotic burning bush or a Japanese barberry and wants that to go out into the forest. But the problem is that they provide a fruit, and many birds, particularly birds that are sort of generalist, will take advantage of those fruits that they find in cities. So robins or other fruit-eating birds will eat those seeds from your yard, and then they take those seeds from your yard and carry them in their digestive tract to whatever next place that they land, and then they plant them, if you will, and then all of a sudden that seed has left your yard. Innocently enough, that seed's left your yard in the digestive tract of a bird that flew away, landed in Ledges State Park, or landed in an adjacent natural area. The seed hits the ground, and that germinates, and then it has no natural predators whatsoever. The same features that made it really desirable to have in our backyard, because it's easy to grow, made it really problematic in the natural area, and now it can take off. Now, of course, every exotic plant is not doing this, and I'm not at all claiming that to be the case, and that's why I acknowledge that benign exotic plants can be okay, or at least not have these negative impacts in natural areas. But many have become problematic, and I try to encourage people to remember that native plants are not going to be problematic. And imagine a world where every single robin leaving a city with a belly full of fruits is actually planting native plants in the adjacent natural areas that for decades have been eroded because every fruit in the robin's belly was an exotic. So I encourage people to think about native plants whenever they can. And then people say, well, what the heck's a native plant? Good question. And you can ask, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. You could ask a dozen biologists and get a dozen answers probably. I don't know that it's perfect. I think there is a general consensus on the point that a native plant is one native to the general ecosystem or the prevailing climate. Here's my logic on this. If I walk through these different options. Some people say, forget about this native exotic business. It's over. It's a globalized society. We move stuff all over the place, and we got to dispense with this idea of native. I don't think we're there. I don't buy that. I think we're going to lose a lot of biological diversity if we just give up. So I think we've got to have some sort of discretion in what is a native and a non-native plant. So then maybe some people say, well, native to North America because the oceans kept all the other stuff away, but anything in North America could have moved around. Well, I don't think that's necessarily perfect either because there's a lot of climatic variability and there are big barriers like mountain ranges and the Great Plains. And so I don't think that that's necessarily the case. The other one that goes a little more extreme than my answer is like, no, it's got to be native to Johnson County. And if it's not native to Johnson County, then I don't want it in my yard. I think that's pretty cool. That's probably, for me, maybe overshooting the mark for most people. I definitely encourage people to do that, and especially in things like prairie reconstructions and other, finding locally adapted native seeds can be really good for a lot of reasons. But I think it maybe overshoots the mark. So my opinion, if you ask 12 wildlife biologists, you get 12 answers. Here's mine. Native to the Midwest. I think if a plant would have been native to northern Minnesota, it could have figured out a way to find its way to Iowa if it wanted to, and it hasn't. And so we can, and it's not going to become problematic. And so this is based a little bit, well, it's based largely on some scientific inference. This is a map from Dr. Jeff Isles in the horticulture department at Iowa State. He and a graduate student studied 28 species of woody plants that colonized and became problematic invasive species in Iowa woodlands. So 28 species, and they studied where those species were from. And you can see that the vast majority of those species came from the exact same latitude and the exact same climatological conditions in the old world and have become a problem in our ecosystems. And of course that makes total sense because they were adapted to those similar geologic and climatic conditions, but they were separated by an ocean and they never got here. Through the process of globalization, we've introduced all those species over here and they're thriving because all their pests are still over there and the good climate and soils is over here and they're pest free. You can also see there's a few species that have taken off from the southeastern United States. So that's sort of what I base my recommendation off of. How do you know when a species is native or not? There's good lists to help you with that. Among the lists that you could use, Iowa Department of Transportation's Living Roadway Trust Fund has just a wonderful resource, particularly for prairie plants. And so you can search, if you go to the nursery and type in the scientific name, you got to find the scientific name. The common names are crazy. Find the scientific name, type it into the search, and it'll help you find it. That's Iowa Living Roadway Trust Fund. The other one that I really like, and this is the one I actually use the most, is the USDA Plants Database. And if you type into Google USDA plants, this will be the first result. Again, search by scientific name. That's the best way to find these things. Search by the scientific name, and it's going to pull up a map. And in this map, green means native. And it's going to tell you whether or not it's native, and you can kind of decide whether or not you want to choose that plant from the nursery. One more resource to share with you on this is if you want a list, if you want to sort of refine your search image for native plants, you can use this cool new resource. Well, there's a couple of resources. I'll share with you some that we've written in Iowa, like extension-specific stuff. But this is kind of a cool new project. The National Wildlife Federation does a lot of really nice advocacy and education for wildlife-friendly landscaping. And they have this native plant finder tool that you can type in your zip code and it'll spit out a list of relatively commonly available native plants that would work in your zip code, which is kind of cool. So that would be another resource for you. So I shared with you the 4 rules for making landscapes work for wildlife. I want to just wrap the talk up with what I think are the keys to success. One is, I don't want to overwhelm you with this stuff. I'm not saying get rid of all the exotics in your backyard tomorrow, or go exclusively to native plants tomorrow, or whatever. Start small. Just start to tinker with stuff. So you could say, you know what, and I'm actually going to do this in my yard this year, I'm just not going to mow that one area. I'm just going to see what happens, including see what the neighbors think. I know what one of them is going to think. That'll be fun. So that's okay. So start small. Just tinker with this stuff. Have a pollinator garden with native plants. plant some native shrubs and see what it does. Or plant some native trees, or pick that out of the nursery. Just start this stuff, and I think you're going to find that this stuff works. These things are adapted to our environments, and gosh, they're pretty. We've got some really cool native plants. And then I think once you start to do that, you're going to have some success, and you're going to start to see the wildlife respond, and then you can expand from there. The next one is we've got to redefine our relationship to weeds. And that is, I think there's a prevailing paradigm, particularly, I mean, we are a predominantly agrarian society, and we tend to think of a very small number of plants are not weeds, and then the rest of them are. This is definitely true in the agricultural landscapes where I work a lot. And I think we've got to just sort of broaden our definition of acceptable plants, or redefine our relationship to weeds. That is to say, I'm soft pedaling this. Wildlife biologists love weeds. I mean, like, annual plants produce a ton of seeds and really good habitat for a bunch of animals. And so I'm not saying you need to let Canada thistle grow all over your pasture, or you need to let, I don't know, ragweed go to bloom in your garden. I'm not saying that, but I am saying sometimes things that look messy to an eye that isn't looking for wildlife habitat, things that look messy may be really good wildlife habitat. And so we may not want to call them messy. We may not want to call them weedy areas. We may just want to call them wildlife habitat. So redefine your relationship to weeds. And then the last one is share what you know. You're going to learn a lot of stuff. I'm sure many of you already are doing a lot of these things and having these cool experiences and seeing native birds and seeing native butterflies. Share what you know and help your neighbors try to overcome the initial inertia, because really I started with this big picture stuff, but we've really got to get all hands on deck. We've all got to be working to address these big challenges that we have as it relates to water, climate, and wildlife in every corner of our state and all across the United States. And so share what you know, talk about why these things are important to you, and try to make the world a better and more diverse place. I think that'll do a lot of good. This little picture over here on the right is just a cool pollinator cafe. It was a native, all native plants in there at our local nursery in Ames, and I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. If this stuff was as easy to find as Japanese barberry on a weekend, we'd have native plants going all over the place, so we've got to try to get to that. Lots of resources available from Iowa State Extension. I'll give you a website on the next page. I wrote an article, Attracting Birds to Your Yard, that synthesizes a lot of this stuff about butterflies. I've got some publications about wildlife structures, woodworking for wildlife, some stuff about rain gardens. All of this is available in various forms. If you go to extension-y websites, this is ours, naturalresources.extension.iastate.edu/wildlife, and there you'll find a little bit of wildlife landscaping. But the horticulture team has some great resources on their Hort News website. And there you can search native plant, and they'll turn up a bunch of stuff as well. So that's all I have, and really looking forward to the question and answer time. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. We're going to take a break now, about a 20-minute break, and you can have our usual array of coffee and cookies and teas. So please help yourself and come back about 20 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Very nice. Very good. I think you're right about tea. Okay, now that everybody's refreshed, maybe not. Hello again. Okay, thank you. We do have a number of, I think, really good questions here, so I will start with that. I think I have it on, don't I? Didn't I have it on? You were, but then you walked away. Oh, okay. Anyway, I'm getting coaching from the side here. So, Adam, do you have suggestions for discouraging neighboring cats in a wildlife-friendly yard?
Someone just said, be nice. Oh.
Are there any deterrents of
Not that I can think of. I mean, there is, of course, things one could, I don't know, harassment, persistent harassment. I really don't. Whoever asked the question, if you'd like to, right? Yeah, you could. I mean, yeah, I guess the most direct way is to talk to the neighbor, and they're the bells, and they have these like reflective collars that are supposed to help, and.
Or a dog?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we get a lot of feral cats in our area.
Yeah.
Big dog, no deer, no cats.
Yeah. So that's good. That's good advice.
Well, I have a little dog and a cat who routinely comes into my yard and has killed birds and stuff in my
Yeah.
yard, and my neighbors just don't care.
Yeah.
They must have had it.
I hear certain, you can get, online or think it's certain sprays that have a smell that repel them. Okay, it's not going to, you're not gonna like the smell either, but.
Right.
There are certain plants, old plants that give off originum or something like that, that they're very beautiful to look at. They're Eurasian,
Yeah.
and I never heard them being invasive the least bit. They have, but they give off, some of them give off a smell that's not pretty, and that cats and dogs avoid. So some garden groups advise you to place where you're using your yard as a personal toilet, that you plant those and it will discourage.
Yeah. Okay. So just to restate for the recording, there's some repellents, and I know there's stuff you could spray. That was kind of the first thing that came to my mind. I mean, the same way you repel a cat, but I don't know that, or excuse me, a rabbit. But I don't know if that's the same way that would work for protecting a bird in the same way. But maybe some other plants that could be selected and planted to repel cats. So and then I think the old-fashioned way of talking to the neighbor would, to the extent possible, or building a fence. That's the other thing. And of course, cats can get across a lot of barriers, but sometimes with deer and rabbits and things, the best defense is a good offense, like being aggressive in terms of keeping them out. Or I think it's the other way. I mixed my metaphor.
Yeah, there's motion detector sprinklers that,
Yeah.
and cats don't like to get wet.
Yeah. Okay. I like that.
Yeah.
But excuse me, motion detected sprinklers, like to deter the cat.
Okay. We'll just go in order here. Purple coneflower can become a monoculture. What do you recommend to plant with it to prevent the purple coneflower from taking over?
Okay, that's a good question. It definitely can get pretty aggressive. And I'll just acknowledge again, I'm not necessarily the best horticulturalist, so I can lean on my own experience. One would be starting it with comparable plants, like plants that are going to be able to compete with it. So I don't know, like once it starts to take over, it may be challenging to kind of get a hold of it. But like what comes to mind is like gray-headed coneflower, black-eyed Susan, some of these other common native prairie plants. If you put them in there with them, you might be able to get sort of equal competition to kind of keep each other in check. That's what comes to mind immediately.
Get a cat and they stomp all
I'm definitely not saying get a cat. We've established that.
I keep it under control with asters.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, asters would be a good one as well. Thinking in terms of similar height and growth patterns and growth chronology. Thanks for sharing.
Okay, thank you. Please address poisonous hemlock that is coming up all over in the field edges, my backyard, and next to the railroad tracks, I'm assuming.
Yeah. Okay, I know you guys are gonna kill me here. Wildlife biologist. So I'm familiar with poison hemlock. It's I'm trying to remember if it's a native. I think it is a native, and they talk about it being one of the most toxic plants in North America. I see it in disturbed areas. I mean, that's what comes to mind. So let me just give you my assessment, and I'm not trying to limp my way through this. Well, I'll acknowledge. I mean, I don't have a remedy necessarily for poison hemlock, but we know the best way to fight an annual plant community is with a perennial plant community. And so poison hemlock, in my experience, is finding it in really highly disturbed areas and colonizing them. Now, lots of things might be out of your control in the railroad right-of-way or other things, because that disturbance is just going to be coming all the time with chemical control of plants along the right-of-ways and other things. But if you can control it and you can try to establish a perennial plant community, native grasses, native wildflowers, or something like that, through careful attention. So we know establishing a prairie, for example, is going to there's a 3-year investment at least, and then there's lots of maintenance afterwards. It's not something you just put the seed in the ground and leave it. But if you could work hard to try to fight those annual or biannual weed pressures and get the perennial plant community established, then you may be a little better off. That's kind of my thought process, or how I'd approach that. And again, on these kind of things, we could get you the resources to connect with the horticultural experts.
Well, I guess we are showing we're a plant group here, so.
I like that. I
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the plant thing. I just worry, yeah.
No, that's
Well,
okay, because I got a couple more for you, but they're all about natives. Is pokeweed native, invasive? Any recommendations? And then additionally, any suggestions for the Siberian elm seedlings, which blew everywhere in the spring?
Okay, so the pokeweed is a native. I remember hearing stories about Native Americans using pokeweed for dyes and various things. So, and so I do know it to be a native. You don't see it a lot in landscapes. It's another one that you see a lot in disturbed areas. What was the nature of the question regarding?
Is pokeweed native, and then is it invasive?
Okay.
Any recommendations?
So I've never seen it be really invasive. So, but let me take the question and just make a point that I didn't make very clearly before, is that, we have invasive species, we have exotic species, we have native species. They are not, there is lots of overlap between them, but one is not synonymous with the other. So invasive is not always synonymous with exotic, and exotic is not necessarily always synonymous with invasive. So to make the point, a familiar example that we all know is eastern red cedar is a native species that as a wildlife biologist I like in moderation, because it produces a nice fruit, and it's a evergreen plant that is common in landscapes where there are often not other native evergreen plants. But all things in moderation, eastern red cedar is really good at proliferating, and you can see pastures and old fields and roadsides that get completely dominated by it, and it grows up and it becomes a monoculture. And any monocultures of any kind are problematic. And so that's a little bit of a value. Well, no, that's true. They are going to have the least biological diversity of monoculture. And so that's an example of a native plant becoming an invasive plant. Pokeweed, the example here, I know it to be a native, hearing no objections. I'm pretty sure it's native. Some of these are, someone asked me about parsnip over the break, and it's like, well, it's been here forever. We know that, in that it's been here as long as we have records. But yeah, I think that one is exotic. But so it can be kind of hard there. I don't know it to be invasive in most of my experience, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't be invasive in your backyard. So yeah, okay, so there you go. And I mean, other examples of natives that become invasive, poison ivy is a really common one. Like, sure, we like to hate poison ivy for the obvious reasons, but poison ivy in moderation is great. It produces a berry, and if it's tall, if it's a tall, mature vine, those berries are way up in the canopy of the trees where not a lot of berries get produced and a lot of berry-eating birds hang out. And so vines in that way are really important. So poison ivy is a great plant as long as you don't get the toxin and as long as it's not overly abundant. And it can quickly become overly abundant in an invasive native species. And so it's the same way with eastern red cedar. And it sounds like in this case, pokeweed can be as well. There again, I think that's what we call early successional, like it does well in disturbed environments. And so figuring out what's disturbing that environment and trying to get a perennial, later successional plant community to establish there may be a tool for fighting it.
Okay, and I think the second part of that, did you speak to
Siberian
Siberian
elm.
elm
Oof.
seedlings?
That is an interesting one. They must have planted it in like windbreaks in Iowa or something. I see this mature Siberian elms in farms, particularly in southeast Iowa. And there's cities where you just see Siberian elm invading. I shared that picture of Siberian elm in my talk was from Muscatine County, and that's actually a native prairie. It's never been plowed, and it's on an ISU research farm. And it's just been invaded by Siberian elm because of the seed rain from the adjacent mature tree. So in terms of how to fight them, I mean, it depends on the environment where you can fight, what tools you can use. Prescribed fire in a prairie could fight, a Siberian elm, but that may not be an option in where you live. Cutting, persistent herbicide, maybe mowing, strategic mowing for those could help. And then the biggest thing is if you can, it's just like the cat thing, like go to the source, like try to figure out if we can get the neighbor to address the seed source of Siberian elm. Is Siberian elm dioecious? Master gardeners in the room? Do you know? Is it dioecious? Like, does it have male and female trees? I don't know if it does. I've always wondered that. But anyway, going to the source, Siberian elm, there's a lot of seed source. And like I said, it seems like we planted a lot of it maybe 50, 60 years ago or something.
Okay, these are related questions. Do you have any recommendations on how to deal with local ordinances that require mowing?
Yeah.
And what resources could be useful for sharing with those in the homeowners associations to combat the perfect lawn mentality?
I love that question. I love the question because I think it is a real challenge. That is sort of an interesting scenario. Now, I'm not going to take on homeowners associations. Like I don't think you can, I don't know, that's up to you. But in terms of the local ordinances, I'm often surprised that that aesthetic is codified in the law. I don't know of a specific resource to point you to that gives you the talking points, but I can help with the talking points. In fact, I'd be kind of interested in that. The talking points are pretty simple. Native plants have deep root systems that improve soil structure and facilitate water infiltration. So that's point number one. Diverse native plants can improve the soil and help us address things like flooding and water infiltration and storm water surges and all these things in in urban areas. Native plants, of course, also provide this appealing aesthetic that we should champion. Again, this is the redefine your relationship with weeds. We shouldn't accept people saying that a messy spot is bad if the messy spot is wildlife habitat. And so that's point number two, is that I think we should really stand strong in our assertion that these areas are right and should be there, and especially on private land. And then point number three, of course, is that we know we have studies to say that diverse native plants in urban areas can help us with big challenges like the monarch butterfly and rusty patch bumblebee and other problematic regulatory things that we see, that we currently have or have coming. And so it's kind of an all hands on deck kind of approach. So I would love to make that argument. That's the kind of thing PhDs like doing. And so I would love to help whoever asks that question. But I definitely recognize that that's a challenge. Now, see, I live in Ames, and Ames is really progressive on this stuff. In fact, the city has rebate programs for homeowners to plant native plants because Ames has these problems with storm surges. And they know that a diversity of roots in the ground all year round that go deep into the soil are going to help them address this problem of stormwater events, major stormwater events that we can't address through, we'd have to re-engineer the city, to address it. And so there are examples of cities that are doing it right, essentially, that we could also point to, but kind of depends on the context.
Yeah, I would think Iowa City would be pretty ripe for that, especially with all the things that get going on here. So somebody take that up and report back, okay?
Yes.
What is the general opinion on feeding birds? Helpful or not? Obviously, they mean other than the native plant feeding. Do they need feeding in the winter?
Yeah, great question, and much more in line with my expertise. Thank you. Whoever wrote that question.
Yay, you got a question.
Okay, so so multiple parts of the question. So I think it's great. Feed birds. It's fun. It brings them closer to view. But there's some precautions, right? We want to do it safely. We want to protect wildlife. That was point number 4. One way to protect wildlife is, the same kind of things. Make sure that, you're not feeding birds and exposing them to cats or whatever, unnatural mortality sources. The business about Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks eating birds off of bird feeders, I'm all for that because it's just a different type of bird feeder, but not everybody's there. But so I don't think we should discriminate on what types of birds we feed. So other safe practices in bird feeding. One is, it's better to feed birds in areas where there is structure nearby. You remember the elements of wildlife habitat, and structure is a big part of that. And so feeding birds close to native shrub plantings or evergreen plantings and things like that is better for the birds, because when the sharp-shinned hawk does show up into the shrubs, they can go to escape. So there's that best practice. The other one is that we do know, for obvious reasons, that bird feeders can be a place for disease transmission. And so, just like the salad bar at the buffet, right, or whatever, and we have this screen, or a cruise ship, right. So we do know how, hot soapy water on the bird feeders is important. To do that every 2 to 3 weeks or so at a minimum to try to keep your bird feeders clean, and use hot soapy water to do that. And so that'll help protect the birds as well. Do the birds need it? Depends on which one you ask. The birds that take advantage of it are benefiting from it, right? Now, we've got big challenges related to bird conservation. That's what we are working on, and all of us are engaged in trying to help birds along. I don't think bird feeding is going to be a way that we do that. The types of birds that we attract to our feeders aren't the birds that are really in trouble, and the impact of our feeders is just probably not big enough to have, to really change anything for the birds. But that's totally fine. We can have fun feeding birds and enjoying nature and learning about things and not expect it to have a global impact. So, yeah.
One thing I did is I have a Bradford pear in my backyard, which is not a real good choice,
Right.
but I have to tell you, they have little tiny pears on them. They're very hard. The spring birds that come through that are looking for something to eat clean that tree off, and they are all over cedar waxwings and blackbirds and whatever. Sometimes a source like that, that's all spread out, the cat can't get to, is a better choice than just to feed it in one place.
Right.
And you may have a place for something like that.
So I would say, particularly for natives, some places Bradford pear is actually a problem.
Yeah.
It hasn't yet become a big problem in Iowa, but in Illinois, there's literally billboards about calorie pear and Bradford pear. So sometimes it depends on the species, but I love the point that you made, which is planting food is really good too. And so I spent a lot of time talking about food, and I was just talking about the food that we grow for wildlife, just because it's multifunctional. But yeah, providing a supplemental food source, again, can be fun. One more point, if I can, on this is, the last point is, I'm thinking exclusively about birds with the feeding, and I want to discourage you from feeding deer. And the reason, so gardeners in the room laugh. The reason I bring it up, though, is because in the case of deer, we have this disease challenge called chronic wasting disease. And that's a scenario where feeding actually really can do harm. And so if we had the equivalent in birds, we'd say stop feeding them. But we don't have that yet with birds. But we do have it with deer. And so we don't want to concentrate deer for any reason. We want to try to keep deer densities relatively low, and we want to try to keep deer from concentrating on artificial food sources because of this looming challenge that we have with chronic wasting disease, which isn't yet in Johnson County, but it's only going to become more challenging in Iowa. So, yeah.
You want to tell the city council that? We would be paying white deer $1,600 a day to kill them off?
Well, so I'm aware of the deer management stuff over here. That's actually sort of a separate issue, is managing deer densities. And actually, managing deer densities is a challenge with deer management. And so in the case of Iowa City, they choose to do that, what they call, population reductions. I don't know the right word for that. We normally do it with hunting. In most of the other cities, we use hunting to try to reduce deer densities. In Iowa City, they hire a contractor to do it. And I don't want to go into that, but managing deer densities is important. So if you own land or have influence over land that is forested or has, especially if it's in a place where it allows hunting, managing deer densities is important and a fundamental responsibility of a landowner, especially in the face of chronic wasting disease. So I got way off on that. But now that's really getting into the things I get excited about.
Going back to the birds,
Yeah.
I've read literature that feeding birds actually has changed migratory patterns. Is there real evidence for that? Is there science behind that, or is that just people's?
I've definitely heard that. You hear it with hummingbirds too, you're going to hurt the hummingbirds if you leave it out. I don't think that's true with hummingbirds. And lots of things change migratory behavior of birds. In wild birds that I work with, changes in agriculture can cause these multi-state shifts in distribution of wintering birds and all this stuff. So we do know wildlife respond to these artificial food sources. I don't know of a study that has definitively linked it. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I just don't know of it off the top of my head. And it's not an issue, at least that I'm aware of. And I hear of a lot of issues. So it's not something that I would lose any sleep about. You could definitely, you will hear that. You'll hear, it messes with their natural signals to migrate and stuff like that. There's a lot of stuff going on that makes a bird want to migrate beyond just food sources. And so, yeah, good question.
Okay. What can we do? What can we do to keep the state tree nursery open?
Buy a bunch of trees would be one. Tell your neighbors. I mean, okay. So let me take the honor or the spirit of the question. That is an amazing resource that we have in Iowa, and we're really lucky to have the State Forest Nursery. It is in Ames, and they grow some really nice seed source or stock, seedling stock, to address issues that we have in natural areas, in urban areas, and in agricultural landscapes. And so it's a really nice resource, and they're very affordable, they're really easy to work with, and good tradition, all the good things. So it is a really nice resource. I don't know exactly in terms of course, policy, advocacy, or anything like that. I don't really know that landscape, and of course don't work in that as a state employee. But I think one thing is when you can, buy your trees from there. It is a little bit hard if you own a small acreage because they sell them in bundles of 25 or more. But me and actually my hockey team, which is what gave me this, a few of us went together and we bought 200 trees and we just split them between 6 of us. You can think of ways to do that. Get with your neighbors and pick out a bunch of different trees, and then and then 25 is no longer intimidating because you can split them between multiple different people. Or what to me was intimidating was I want 25 shrubs, but I don't want 25 shrubs of one species. And so that's what going in with my friends allowed me to do, is try to get a diversity of trees, and then we split them up. So yes, thank you for the question. I think it's a really good resource that we should try to support and take advantage of. We should, if you have big property that you own or have influence over, then order the big bundles of trees and plant them and reforest the countryside. That's wonderful. If you own a small acreage, then go in with your master gardener group or go in with your neighbors and order a diversity. And they're shipping soon. I was just there the other day. So. It's called the State Forest Nursery. And if you search on Google, you'll find that, and they have an online ordering interface and everything. Now, these are not like potted plants you're going to get at the nursery. And in fact, it's not intended to be. The whole idea was relatively large-scale projects, particularly in ag lands. But yeah, you could grab those. They have a bunch of different native shrubs. They have a bunch of different native trees. They're relatively small, but I've planted a bunch of them in my yard, and they're doing quite well.
Okay, and this is another plant question. Why is the wild rose not used in public gardens or highway roadsides as it is the state flower?
I love that question.
Okay.
I wish I could pull this back up. So yesterday I gave a talk. Well, here, if you guys will humor me. Is that the last question?
I have one more, but
Okay, we got time. Humor me on this one. I love this question. Oh, I don't necessarily need that to be pulled back up. I'll just read it off of my screen. Does anybody know the story of the native rose, like how it is that it came to be our state flower? It's an awesome story, and it's worth telling. And here's my thing. You remember, so I like to think on these like imagine if kind of things. So I told you one of them. Imagine if every seed in a robin's belly leaving the city was a native plant. We were all of a sudden native plant. Imagine if. The other imagine if that I really like is, what if every kid in Iowa knew what the prairie rose was and felt really attached to it because of the history of the prairie rose in our state? And so it's our state flower. You've all seen it at least on a license plate because it's the pink flower that the goldfinch is on the Iowa DNR REAP license plates, which is also really cool because those are two state symbols on the state license plate. The prairie rose, but you may not have seen it anywhere else. In fact, I haven't seen it a ton of places, though I am seeing it more and more now that I look for it. But it's a relatively modest rose. It's not like what you're familiar with, the really modified horticultural varieties, but you'll see it in roadsides and you'll see it in natural areas. In 1897, I just have a slide pulled up that I shared yesterday in a talk about native plants. In 1897, the prairie rose was named Iowa's state flower. And the reason it was named the Iowa state flower was because it was put on the silver set that was put on the USS Iowa that was christened in the same year. So the USS Iowa had this silver set, like serviceware, and I doubt they do that anymore, but a really neat original silver set. You can see it in Des Moines at the State Historical Museum. The silver set, and I have a picture of it on this slide. And they did it because this rose was so common in Iowa's prairies and farmsteads that it became symbolic with the Iowa experience, particularly the rural Iowa experience. Of course, this is a time where most people in Iowa were living in the countryside. And so I'm going to read to you a poem because I love this poem, and I think everybody should know this story, that they read on the State House floor about the prairie rose. So, has seen the wild rose of the west, the sweetest child of the morn. Its feet the dewy fields have pressed, its breath is on the corn. The gladsome prairie rolls and sweeps like billows to the sea, while on its breast the red rose keeps the white rose company. It has two colors, like it can be multiple colors. The wild, wild rose, whose fragrance dear to every breeze is flung, the same wild rose that blossomed here when Iowa was young. O sons of heroes, ever wear the wild rose on your shield, which is a reference to the boat. No other flower half so fair in love's immortal field. Let others sing of mountain snows or palms beside the sea, the state whose emblem is the rose, the fairest far to me. I just love that. I love the history and the connection to a plant, a native plant. So whoever asked the question, I didn't set it up, but I love the question. And I can't answer it. Why doesn't every kid in Iowa school know what the prairie rose is? And even better yet, see it when they walk into the school, it's on the ground. Or the same way our state tree is the oak, which is cool because it's not a specific oak. If it were to be, it would probably be the bur oak because that's the one you can find in all 99 counties. But it's cool that it's just the oak because we have like 9 species of oak in Iowa, and in southeastern Iowa, you can find a bunch of them. And it's the state tree, and they're amazing for wildlife, of course, for issues we already talked about. So why doesn't every kid know what a native oak tree is or see those when they walk in? I don't know the answer to the question, but I sure would like to get it to be that way if prairie rose could become more mainstream. The scientific name, it's worth knowing because they really manipulate, the rose situation. So the scientific name of prairie rose is Rosa arkansana. It's Arkansas with an NA after it. That's Iowa State flower. So did I capture the sentiment of the question? I don't have an answer, but I love the question. I think it's, we should do this. And there's other really cool culturally important species that I think we should try to learn and champion. It's part of embracing the diversity of this place that I think is really important if we're going to address these challenges related to biodiversity conservation. And frankly, it just makes life a little more interesting to embrace the diversity of the place where you live. And since we're in a library, I'll recommend a book on that spirit called Braiding Sweetgrass. It's an amazing book, and it really changed the way I think about these kind of things. And she is a Native American author, and she was talking about how a country of immigrants hasn't come to appreciate and embrace the diversity of the place where they've immigrated, essentially. And she says we should do that. We should champion the natural biological diversity of the place that we are. She says put 2 feet on the shore, and I really like that. And I think education on things like the prairie rose and the oak and the 300 other species of tallgrass prairie flowering plants would be a good way to do that.
Okay, thank you. One final question. This is an animal one. Can you address, and I'm not quite sure exactly how this, can you address attracting wildlife that you may not want, like groundhogs?
Right. Yeah. Dang. Yeah, I mean, that's of course, when I say, I'd say attracting wildlife, and I of course acknowledge that with that comes some unique challenges. So here again, the basics, so I'll just go through the basics of wildlife conflict resolution, which the first and basically the main point is it's so much easier to change human behavior than it is to change wildlife behavior. My job would be a lot easier if we could just talk to them, but they don't seem to be listening. And so it is, things like direct control of wildlife, like we can do that, right? Like sometimes we need to do that. We need to address the problem. It's a single offending animal or whatever. Then a single groundhog underneath the shed, maybe we address that with what we call direct control. But look at what is creating the situation to allow for the wildlife to become a pest and try to address that. Try to take something away, change the environment in a way that makes that issue just no longer an option for the critter. And so this is back to like the whole rabbit thing. People want to like trap rabbits and shoot rabbits and all this stuff. In your backyard, it's so much easier to just build a fence that excludes a rabbit, in the same way with deer. Or what you may learn is that you just need to change your expectations for which plants you can grow. Someone asked me a question about white cedar during the break. And if you live in an area that's got a bunch of deer, you're probably just not going to have very pretty white cedars or arborvitae, at least until they get really tall. Same with yew, like the YEW or in the taxa genus. That stuff is like candy to deer. And so if you live in a neighborhood that has a bunch of deer, you probably just can't plant it. You should pick something that they don't like, and there are a list with that. There are lists of species that they don't like. In fact, Minnesota has a really good list, and that I've read. And so that's one thing. And then so then the solution is unique to every house, every farm, and every species of wildlife. It is, if you start attracting a bunch of wildlife, you may all of a sudden attract a groundhog or something like that. Now, if the groundhog isn't doing any damage to the house and is eating a few plants, it's up to you to decide whether or not that's tolerable. It's all relative. But if you need to do something about it, then there's options. And it depends. Lots of wildlife are afforded protections under the law, and so you can't do things to some wildlife that you can to others, and it's a really case-by-case basis. So, yes?
Does feeding Can squirrels cause an overdensity population because they have larger litters?
I don't know that to be the case. Yeah, I can't, it would depend, it's probably really localized. Generally, I don't think that feeding has that much of an impact, but I guess if they were just getting a huge amount of food subsidized, then maybe they could have higher reproduction and eventually higher survival. I mean, that's how populations respond to unlimited resources. So I could imagine it. I don't think it's an issue across the state. And I don't know that it necessarily like threatens squirrel populations or anything, community.
Yeah, I was referring more to like, you have bird feeders and they gorge on them daily.
Right.
And then next thing you know, they chewed up $4,000 worth of wires.
Right. Right, yeah. Yes. So, yeah, I mean, keeping the squirrels off the bird feeder is, I don't know, a perennial challenge for people all over the place. I don't know. It probably helps. There's a lot of things going for a squirrel in an urban environment. There's a lot of artificial food available, lots of foraging places, and not a lot of predators. And so squirrels can really kind of take off, and maybe sometimes they get into places we don't want them. So, yes?
I don't know if it's true or not. I've always heard that the gray squirrels are the nasty ones and they chased off all the red and the black.
Yeah.
How does the red, black, and gray all?
So the question is about like just interaction between different squirrel species. 3 species of squirrels in Iowa. One is called red, but maybe sometimes people say red and they're thinking of fox squirrels. Red squirrels are like really small. Some people call them piney squirrels and they yell at you. Big and bushy tail. That's a fox, called a fox squirrel. And then the gray squirrels. I'm agnostic on the rank of the different species of squirrels. I hear this, and my dad actually, like in Indiana, is like engaged in warfare against gray squirrels for the same logic. They do occupy different what we call successional stages of forest. So gray squirrels are classically associated with relatively mature forest stands, and fox squirrels are like kind of like the prairie squirrel. I mean, as close to a prairie squirrel as a tree squirrel can get. And so they like kind of open grown areas with lots of oak trees and like parks, savannas, those kind of places. And fox squirrels do better there. Sometimes we see gray squirrels come in, and when trees are like the habitat is changing to favor gray squirrels more than fox squirrels. So there's a little bit of that. Sometimes it's like we forget about that the trees grew up and maybe they're a little less attractive to a fox squirrel than a gray squirrel. And then there is definitely some agnostic interactions between, like the antagonistic interactions between the different species of squirrels. But I don't really, whether or not one's better than the other, I don't really think too much on. Red squirrels are relatively more threatened in Iowa, but that's just because we're kind of on the edge of their natural range.
What about the black ones?
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So black ones are melanistic phases. So that is still a fox squirrel, and it's just black because it's has a bunch of melanin in its, I don't know, DNA or something. I don't know exactly what causes it. But you see, like some cities have a bunch of black squirrels, and then some cities don't. And so it is a genetic thing. So it's confusing. It's the exact same species. It's still a fox squirrel. It just happens to have it's in this what we call melanistic phase where it looks black. It is very confusing. But, yeah. Yeah.
Last animal question.
Probably should be the last question.
Okay.
What about attracting larger animals or like snakes and foxes?
Yeah.
And
So the question is, what about attracting larger animals like snakes and foxes? The basics go back to the habitat figure. Like, what is it that those animals need? Foxes, they're going to need a relatively large landscape. The interesting thing about foxes, do people see foxes in Iowa City, or do you guys see foxes? So do you see coyotes in Iowa City? Okay. So oftentimes, foxes and coyotes don't get along. And so you either have foxes or you have coyotes in certain areas of the city or whatever. We find that they both adapt pretty well to city life. In fact, this is an aside, but I want to share the story because it was awesome. On Friday morning, I was on Iowa State's campus walking to a meeting in the Union, and I watched a red fox kill a rabbit, like right underneath the campanile. And it was like the coolest thing I've seen. I mean, it was cool. And students like all over the place. I mean, it was cool. So they adapt well to cities. But what you do in your yard is not necessarily going to attract them. I mean, providing a food source, which in their case would be like small mammals mostly, can be good, and maybe eventually they show up. If you have them on your land, though, you want to protect. They're probably bound, like they of course den, and so you want to protect their dens from disturbance and things like that. That can be good for foxes. Snakes, it kind of depends on the snake and depends on the surrounding habitat. But I mentioned the down logs thing. That can be really good for snakes. Brush piles can be really good for snakes. Even things like rocks in a landscape, like big rocks, can be attractive to go underneath them or go on top of them. And then even people will take like broken pots, like planters, like that you would put flowers in, and if they're broken, and just like turn them upside down, and it creates like a little thermal refuge that reptiles and amphibians will use. So those kind of things can be attractive. And for everybody that just got scared to death because of snakes, apply the opposite. Fewer brush piles, fewer rocks, fewer dead logs, those kind of things. So yeah, but I appreciate the spirit of the question. You can see I have a bird brain. I do all my research on birds. And I think in terms of birds first, and butterflies second, and then bats, and then everything else. And so you heard my bias. So thanks for asking the question.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
And I'm gonna ask Adam to pull